Good evening and welcome. I'm Jonathan Albin and this is Nikos RPG, and welcome to the Game Master's Toolbox. Today we're going to be walking through the processes and the methodology by which I storytell, and we're going to be looking at it from the standpoint of perspective. Because how big is your imagination? What size and dimension is your thought process? I haven't really got a framework of understanding how big or possibly large an imagination might be, but I endeavor to try to keep mine expanding and growing in wider and different directions all the time. So I'm going to talk through my process and also show you what I call the as the saying would go, the windmills of my mind. I'll show you where the rocks are, so to speak. So before we do that, make sure you hit all the buttons down below so we let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience. And let's get started, shall we?
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Greetings and welcome, and I hope you didn't have any difficulty finding this place. I know there's only a million other places literally you could go to look at videos, and I greatly appreciate you being here with us. Today we're going to be talking about the imaginative process and how we can go about building out our ideas, and whether that be creating a story base for a novel or a structure for building a role-play game, or simply just knowing what you're going to do on Friday night when all your players show up and you haven't got a story built yet. We're going to help you out. So today we're going to be looking at some of the spaces in the framework that I've built. As a game master with 50 years of experience, you tend to get pretty proficient on what boundaries and limitations and structures that you put in place to make your creativity extend as much as possible into the areas that you want to pursue. So we're going to be going basically place by place, room by room within my mind, if you will, and we're going to talk about how creativity is spawned by each of them and how you might be able to utilize this same sort of a mechanism to build a structure from which you can launch your adventures. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the veranda. And the veranda is, if you will, the front porch. It is generally a place where I'm seated with my back to the adventures I've already created and the history upon which I've built my stories firmly in place behind me. And in the process, the opportunity to look outward upon the things that are going on in the world and perhaps find into tidbits and nuggets that I can use to make my adventures better. Now, before we go very deeply into that, I do want to address the elephants in the room, and one of which is the idea that the way we speak sometimes gets in the way of what we're trying to say. And so, predicated on the fact that I've been GMing for 50 years, that's a long time. And ironically, as you build a story around let me rephrase that. As you build your adventures around the story you've created, it becomes a framework and a basis upon which everybody that engages with it operate. And therefore, ironically, despite having 50 years of GMing experience, I do tend to have speech patterns and methodologies that some may find to be confusing at worst, at best, and offensive at worst. And so I want to kind of address the elephant of the room in terms of the process and the words. And I want everyone to realize that my purpose for doing this, my very reason for existing in this space, is to make your games better week over week and make the games more excellent if I can. And therefore, there is at no point am I what I'm trying to say intended to upset or downplay another person's strategies or their methodologies for playing the games that they run. So I may find myself in opposition in terms of other storytellers, and the best I can say is that each of us arrives in this environment with our own framework of imagination and creativity, and I focus mine on making your games the best I can make them. So the other elephant that I want to talk about when I say multiple elephants, the other concept that I want to talk about is the concept of publication. I have indeed published my own role-playing game, and I do not mean in any way to take away from the creativity, the legacy, or the structure of another's creation, but to specify that the role-playing game Nyko's RPG will be the reference which I will go to occasionally when we're dealing with attributes and skills and such in game play, and so therefore there will be numeric values that are given in percentage base rather than a threshold die roll against a 20. So I just wanted to get those both out of the way before we talk about any more things in reference to the creativity of it. So to talk about, therefore, this veranda, it's comfortable enough to seat as many people as want, and if you are a viewer in this video and you want to be a part of our conversation, feel free to put comments in the chat box. I don't have all the time necessary to always read what's going on there, but generally I try to keep my eye on what's going on there to provide any answers as I can within the theme of the story that we're talking about. And we have several other rooms to go through, so we're not going to spend all afternoon here on the veranda, although arguably with the sun going down in the west and a nice calm evening ahead of us, it's a place where I wouldn't mind staying, but we're going to be moving on to other parts of the structure. But at this point, just realize that the veranda has a place for seating for plenty. It's simply appointed. I have a couple of tables so that we can put our beverages, whether they be, as mine is, a lightweight, or whether you are more into adult beverages. Nonetheless, there's a place for them to sit on the table. It's an open air porch, so if you are inclined to smoking, which has become kind of a bad word, or vaping as the more common methodology is, I suppose, today, feel free to imbibe, because this is supposed to be a place of comfort, a place of joy, and it is a place to be comfortable with what's been created before. We don't have to sit and worry about what's in the bookshelves and what's inside the structure. We'll get to those soon enough. But it's just a nice place to relax. Matter of fact, I've got a bit of a rocking chair going on. Of course, I'm getting older, and so ultimately the idea of a rocking chair probably fits somebody of my what shall we say, tenure. So now let's go on and head inside, and I'll introduce you to the next part of the house that's relatively important to role-playing and a basis for how I've come to the 50 years I have. And if there's any questions you have, by the way, feel free to include those either, as I said, in the chat box or in the comments section below after this gets to YouTube, which it will eventually. Okay, so now we're going to introduce you to the library. And my metaphoric library is big enough that it would encompass a fairly decent-sized living room in terms of racks and racks of books. Now, as you may see, I've got a small collection behind me of some of the titles that other people might be familiar with and whatever. But we're going to talk today about the book list in terms of what you should have in your, if not in your back history, perhaps in your current queue for books to be read. And of course, the original book that you need to have, I believe you need to have consumed, or at least be fairly aware of, would be the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien, his prequel, The Hobbit. And I would add to that, in fairly short order, in close proximity, C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, because they're an interesting juxtaposition of two different styles of fantasy storytelling, focusing in different ways on what is critical, what is necessary, and what is important. And they provide a richness and a depth to the concept of role-playing games that are often overlooked if all you've read is the Player's Handbook or the Dungeon Master's Guide. Now, don't get me wrong, I required, especially when I was younger and had kids at home, I required my son and his friends all to have read the Player's Handbook back to front to back to make sure that they understood what they were dipping their toes into and to provide them with the actual assets to build out a story. But the concept, therefore, of having in my book list the rule books, that's almost a given. If you're going to be a role-play game master, you need to have read your materials for the particular property or title that you are pursuing. In addition to the two that I've mentioned, though, there are literally hundreds of authors, and whether they be recent or decades ago, the advantage to fantasy role-playing is that the fantasy books that are recommending themselves to the setting tend to be ageless, whether you're talking about Anne McCaffrey's Dragonlance series or Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy or Frank Herbert's Dune Legacy. They're all really useful for reading to get a concept of the wider world. If you are a storyteller, whether you have gotten to the point of building a story outside of a local village or whether you have continent hopping adventurers in your group, either which way, the information that you draw from the written material is inestimable. And so the basic book list will expand. I will actually each week go through and I'll put a bibliography, if you will, for us in the description of future episodes. I'm lazy enough today. I'm not going to do it for this episode, but in the future, when I build out parts of our library, we will go ahead and actually give those references as well. But the idea here is that the library, again, is a quiet place for contemplation and for working on the research for your world, for the adventure that you're running. Perhaps it's to find new monsters or new ways of considering monsters and such. But the idea is that the books that you read inform your awareness of the world around you and give you new places to launch your stories from. So we'll come back to the library on another adventure, but let's head on in a little farther to the next room. So the drawing room is, maybe it's a little bit of a pun, maybe not, but the idea of the drawing room here is where we're going to talk about the representation of the world that you're creating, whether that be through a written form like a map, such as the one here, or whether you're going to be utilizing theater of the mind to simply describe your locales and let the players do the work of establishing the documentation, if you will. And as you note, I've got a header up here in the drawing room called the Matrioshka method. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong or butchering it, but Matrioshka or Matrioshka, I'm not sure how that's exactly said. Probably saying it wrong. But the idea is of nesting dolls. That, for example, this map has tons and tons of data on it. It's got the names of cities, of towns. There are rivers, mountains, forests, and such. And the information is itself very broad in spectrum. But if the players are, for example, visiting the village of Bridgeton, the town of Bridgeton, then they are going to be located in the hex where the first capital letter is, and they are within that space, and that space is the whole of what Bridgeton is. So there is literally a nesting doll the size of Bridgeton, so to speak, which has all of the interactions and the potential people they might meet. Now, does it give them all names? No, but it does give naming convention, the culture, the various referential estates that might be in that area and such, so that the players have the opportunity to engage in their adventures within that framework. And the idea is that your nesting dolls start at where the players are right now, and then to where the players might be within a day or two, and then where the players intend to go, which is the larger scale, and then eventually you get to the world-size map such as this one. But the idea is that the players are pursuing their agenda, and you're making the adventure as close to what they're doing as possible. As a matter of fact, I want to show you this. You see here in the middle of the map, I've got the word label. And the reality is that the story is growing fast enough that I didn't get all of the map finished before I printed the silly thing. So there you have it. But the idea is that the map has changed its focus and its purpose and its tint over time. But nonetheless, every step of the Matrioshka, it really does apply to what the players are doing. And at different weeks, we will talk about each of these various levels. And don't think that these levels are something that are frameworked and required to be a participant only by the way I describe it. So think in terms of your own games. How can you make your creation process simplified by simply scaling your question and resolving the question at that particular scale of adventure, instead of always having to grind through what the players might be doing right now. All right, so let's head on over to the next area of the mansion of my mind, so to speak. All right, welcome to the kitchen. Now, if you don't mind, there's a bit of steam coming from the pot over there. I've got 3 things boiling. We'll talk about those in a second. But the idea of the kitchen, this is where the messy parts happen. This is where we end up, actually we play on that kitchen table right over there because it's far less pretentious than sitting in a big fancy room. And it's where your mind goes when you're actually operating the role-playing game. But you have to have certain elements ready to go so you can make a full meal out of the adventure, so to speak. So we're going to be talking about that. And in particular, I have on what I call my stock pot. And in the stock pot, you have the things that you start your adventure with. And without these, you really don't have a structure for them. And that's the setting, theme, and plot. Now, if we're going to do this in an analog fashion, if we're going to draw the comparisons, setting in this case is the fundamental overlay, the basic stock. It's what the rest of the world is based around. It's in the case of the world of Nikos, it's the planet, it's what the sun looks like, what the sky looks like, what the air smells like. It's the defining location of where the players are, and not necessarily anything beyond that. When you start out, you want to map as much as is necessary from the standpoint of the Matrioshka that we talked about. So you're going to build out the adventures that they'll run into today, the adventures they might run into within a couple, 3 hours of their start, and then ultimately the ones that are much further away that the players might adventure to. And all of these elements of the setting are the basic, and they're going to keep being useful. And so that's why I do the comparison to it being the stock of our stew here. The next thing we need to add in is a healthy dose of the theme. And this has more to do with how you're telling your story. So, for example, if you are wanting to build an adventure in the, say, 1930s, 1940s of the pre-war, or perhaps even into the Second World War, it's nice to build that with ambiance and things that draw attention to it. So one of the things that, for example, is provided by the Nikos RPG in Dawn Soldiers is a basic glossary, if you will, of terms that were used in that time frame, so that you can build out the script or create a template for how your NPCs react that are drawing from actual terms that were used historically. And while it's not a requirement for roleplay, it's a really handy tool for making the game feel more like that period. And the setting and the theme, I guess you'd say the equivalent of calling what we're talking about here is the idea of it being a chicken soup. So the setting makes it a soup. That's the basic descriptions and a little bit of seasonings to give it a particular flavor. And then you chunk in the chicken, so to speak, the theme, the pieces that are meaty, the parts that the players can bite into and grab a hold of and manipulate and use in their building of their story that they're wanting to create within your world. And then finally, this is something that is literally flavored to taste, the idea of adding plot. And plot is basically the story thread. For example, if your players have an agenda of going, say, to Europe and getting involved in the actual war, then that is itself a plot. And whether it fits with what the players are doing immediately, or if it's only something they might find themselves doing down the road, the idea is that you've now included in your chicken soup the very position of where that is in the course, whether that makes this a appetizer, so to speak, where you're bringing up their interest and getting them going, knowing that you're going to change it down the road. But the idea is that the plot is malleable and the players can actually decide how much of it they wish to draw upon. And so by having these three constantly available right here to be used in the kitchen, in the place where they play, in the place where they're driving the story, this is really handy. Some people refer this to like the module that the game master is utilizing if you're running in a pre-printed, pre-created adventure. Then the module acts as the preheated stock pot, so to speak, and has all three of these basics in it, and are therefore, once you as a storyteller have read through the materials, then you can actually add in liberal doses whenever the players need to. Now, we're not going to get our hands dirty in the kitchen today. We're going to spend more time going through the rest of the structure, but I wanted you to know that when we are dealing with the basics, we'll be right here in the kitchen, and that'll be generally before the adventure, and we'll get more into that in a later episode. So the next we're going to come into the nice comfortable den. And just like the veranda, this is a place where you can stretch out, stretch back. It can be during the game, but generally the idea of the den process is when you're actually processing what happened in the adventure. I usually utilize a mechanism called the debrief, where I call the players to another location and we simply talk about what happened in the game. As a matter of fact, on our Discord, once you become a member of the Patreon and get brought into the Discord, you can find us hanging out quite often in the debriefing room, because that's where we can talk about anything or everything, but generally it's focused on processing the things that happened in a particular adventure. And the real benefit of this comes from what happens in the game. For example, if you are a game master like I am, you tend to tell too much. You tend to overtalk, spend more time in description than is necessary. And so that's the reason why I bring up white space today. The idea is that when you are telling a story, the players need certain mechanistic pieces. They need certain elements of the story so that they can process and move forward. And these can be very detailed, but the more detail you take, the more time you're taking away from play. And as a friend of mine likes to say, he would much prefer it if I showed rather than told them what's going on. And so realize that the benefit of white space is that when I'm telling a story and you're listening, you're processing it into a vision within your own mind. You're figuring out what it looks like from my descriptive terms, but the image that you're creating is wholly yours. And if I've done my duty and there is plenty of white space, then your vision and my vision can actually be dissimilar, and yet we will be able to still work together because the understanding of the places that are described helps to inform the places that are not. And the real benefit, therefore, of white space is it gives us the opportunity for the player's agency and the game master's agency to not conflict, even though they are sometimes adversarial. So here in the den, after the session, we can talk about, well, that part of the game I was a little confused on, so let me get additional clarity without taking away from the game time. We're able to get some nuance and detail and description that perhaps wasn't there beforehand, or the players spend some time going over what they did experience and give feedback in terms of what they got from what I said, which helps me to improve in my descriptive capabilities. But the idea is that the white space is the part where we can both agree even if we disagree, and it's a great mechanism for any role play game out there. And the den is the perfect place to bring those things up because we're no longer in the action of the game, we're now in the after action, and we talk about what actually happened versus what we perceive should have happened, and therefore if we need to even look at modifications or retcons if that's absolutely necessary. So the last area I'm going to get to in the house today is the mudroom. And this is where you go when you have something that is dirty work you need to do. As I've listed up above, there are times when the players are tired of the storyteller. They don't get what's going on. They've lost the ball. They don't like the direction that the story is going and have decided to fire the game master. And it's not a fun place to go, but I put it up here in that light because that is one alternative. That is, the players can simply use the power of their vacancy and simply not show up. This is by the vast majority, this is how most people let a game master know that they're dissatisfied. Now, it gets a little trickier when it's the other way around, and generally it's usually when one player has overstepped some boundaries and the game master is obligated to bring those to his attention and resolve the situation. And in certain cases that means players have to be let go. And this is done in the mudroom. That means you're not doing it at the game session. You're not even doing it necessarily at the location where you normally play. You're finding a third location where the emotion that rises from the conflict can be diffused as quickly as possible and without interrupting or hindering the story elements at all. The idea here is that sometimes the mudroom has to be used to take care of, quote, the garbage of meta gaming, which unfortunately can spill over into a session if put in close proximity. So by doing this in a fashion where you are, okay, we are not in the game right now, we are not in the realm of the fantasy setting, and we're not in the idea of the group, but this is the 411. It has to happen. This has to go down. And so therefore it gives both the game master and the player the opportunity to make sure, we're not in this channel, there we go. Just want to make sure we're still. So it gives everybody the opportunity to voice their dissatisfaction. Now, note that in the case of a game master, quote, firing a player or asking a player to no longer play, that is arguably one of the trickiest places to be, and no game master worth the salt wants to do so unless there's absolutely no other alternative to keeping the game moving forward. So don't look at this as a place that you want to go to. Don't go to the mudroom with somebody on a frivolous nature, but make sure that you're going to this psychological place when the work needs to be done, and it needs to be done swiftly and cleanly as possible. And so in the mudroom, if it gets a little dirty, you can clean it up and square it away before other players become involved. So that's my content for you on the mudroom. We'll talk more, of course, about the other rooms in the house and such moving forward. Alrighty, now that we've fixed the sound problem, let's see, I'm making sure I got the right camera. All right. So, Nikos RPG and the Game Master's Guide are here for you all the time. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to stop by any time. By that I mean if you are a member of our Patreon, you can join with us on Discord, talk to us there. I'm also recording Monday through Friday, generally 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. Pacific. Obviously tonight's episode ran way late because I had problems with my audio, and I'm still trying to make sure that that's not a problem even in this episode. But Monday through Friday, as I said, 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. I'm looking forward to your input now. How do you run your adventures, and do you have a room you would suggest that I add to this Mansion of Madness? Yes, I understand that everybody operates differently, and the way I've described it probably is not quite adequate for what you're looking for. So let me know in the comments how I can make the Game Master's Guide be more helpful to you, because this is all about making your game sessions excellent. Now, I need to get going, so thank you for being here. Like and subscribe and all that nonsense, and I will see you in the next episode.